At one point in Welsh history, if you were struggling with any kind of problem, if, for example, you had lost a treasured item in your home and you really wanted to find it, or perhaps all of your sheep had suddenly fallen ill, or maybe that Mary Sue down the road had given you the evil eye, the person that you would go to for help was your local cunning man, cunning woman, or, as we say in Welsh, dyn hysbys, that means cunning man, gwraig hysbys, cunning woman, dyn cyfarwydd, or gwraig cyfarwydd, are also alternate names for cunning men and cunning women, and also, of course, the swynydd, the magicians, the folk magicians. You would go to these people for various ailments, various different issues that you were struggling with, whether it was something that you wanted help with on a physical level, such as a physical illness, or whether perhaps it was a spiritual ailment that the church possibly could not help you with. You would go to these strange, whimsical, flamboyant characters who would, of course, partake in a little bit of theatre. They would have a room set up filled with their collections of magical items, and in the centre of that room would be the glorious Llyfr Cyfrin. The Llyfr Cyfrin was a magical book. It translates literally to mean Book of Secrets, or Book of Mystic Secrets specifically. And this book would be huge, like a large family Bible, bound together in chains, and some even said that strange, wicked spirits dwelled within the book, familiar spirits to the folk magician that was consulted by the people. And these people would be approached for various different issues, as I've already mentioned, one of those issues being issues pertaining to the fair folk. If you thought that your child had been snatched away and replaced with a changeling, it is the folk magician that you would seek out. If you thought that the fairies were haunting you and causing all sorts of ill wishes upon you, then you would seek out the folk magical practitioner, and they would help you. Nowadays, when we talk about fairies in a magical sense, most people say, stay away, we don't want anything to do with that. But historically speaking, the magical practitioners did have relations with fairies, whether that is by summoning them literally within their magical rituals, or dealing with their mischief and malice. Croeso, welcome to the Welsh Witch podcast. My name is Mhara Starling. Oh, it's been a while, hasn't it? It's been a while since my last episode. I've taken a little bit of a hiatus. I had a very, very busy year last year. Ooh, I can't wait to announce all the wonderful things that will be coming in the next year. Now, this episode today was recorded almost a year ago. I'm giving myself a little slap on the wrist because I allowed it to be this long between recording and release, and I have quite a few episodes coming up, just like this one that was recorded around a year ago, but now finally I'm getting round to editing and putting them out there. But I'm very excited for this episode in particular, because I have the wonderful Andrew Phillip Smith on the show. Now, if you're not familiar with Andrew Phillip Smith, Andrew dubs himself as a bit of an esotericist. He's an author and a publisher. He runs the publishing house Bardic Press. Some of you might have already bought books from Bardic Press, such as the Will Parker edition of the Mabinogi. And recently, Andrew has come out with a new book, and that book is titled Pages from a Welsh Cunning Man's Book, Magic and Fairies in 19th-Century Wales. Oh, doesn't that just sound thrilling? So Andrew and I will be discussing things to do with magicians, magic, folk magic, fairies, and more in today's show. Andrew is also the voice behind the Welsh Myth and Legend and Magic account over on what was formerly Twitter, now called X, of course. You might be following him. He's under @MythWelsh on there, and he likes to post a lot about Welsh myth and sources to do with Welsh lore and such. So in today's episode, we will be unveiling all that we can about magic and fairies throughout Welsh history. If you're interested in Andrew's book that I previously mentioned, this is the endorsement that I gave the book. Anyone with an interest in magic, folklore, or even Welsh history in general will find something in this book. Read it and revel in the magic of Wales's traditional folk magical culture. One thing in particular that we talk a lot about during this episode is a book titled Byd y Dyn Hysbys. Byd y Dyn Hysbys by Kate Bosse Griffiths. It's a book that was released around the 1970s or 1980s, I can't quite remember right now, and it's a book that essentially explores the history and the lore surrounding the Cunning man within a Welsh specific context. I will create a tiny little glossary of some of the words and such that we used in this episode, such as Llyfr Cyfrin, Dyn Hysbys, Byd y Dyn Hysbys, the book, and provide you with some information on those things in the description below. So do check that out if you are not a Welsh speaker and you're wondering about the spellings and such, and you want to dig into this topic deeper. So without further ado, welcome to the Welsh Witch podcast. Sit back, get yourself a nice hot beverage, and let's discuss magic and fairies throughout Welsh history and lore with Andrew Phillip Smith. So I'm here with the wonderful Andrew, and I'm delighted to have you on the Welsh Witch podcast. Welcome. And today we're going to be talking specifically about the connections between fairies and magicians within Welsh history and lore. So I just want to say hi, Andrew. Welcome to the Welsh Witch podcast.
Hi, Mhara. Thank you for having me again.
Gosh, the pleasure is all mine, honestly. So first and foremost, I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about yourself. So who are you and how did you fall down this wonderful rabbit hole of magicians and fairies?
Well, let's see, I'm a writer and I think I'd like to call myself an esotericist because that kind of covers a wide range of interests that I have. And most of my published work so far have been on the subject of Gnosticism. So I've written probably about half a dozen books, Secret History of the Gnostics, Lost Teachings of the Cathars, John the Baptist and the Last Gnostics, and some more specific books, a dictionary of Gnosticism as well. And I had a journal, The Gnostic, that I edited for a few years. And I'm from Wales, from Penarth, and I lived here till I was 21, went to university in Swansea, but then I moved away. And although I came back to visit my family, and I did spend 6 months living in Aberystwyth on a little bedsit that looked out onto Cardigan Bay and the Irish Sea. For the most part, I wasn't living here. And I lived sort of in and around London for about 10 years, in California for about 10 years, and in Dublin in Ireland for 10 years. And then we moved back. I moved back with my Irish wife, and we bought a house that built at the end of the 18th century. It's a typical sort of Glamorgan cottage. It was an undertaker's for 50 years in the 19th century. And we actually have a wizard buried nearby, just sort of less than 5 minutes walk away. So when I was coming back to Wales, I wanted to research and write about Welsh themes, which had been close to my heart for a long time, since the kind of 80s or 90s. And it'd taken me quite a while to kind of sort of gather momentum, and I'd kind of run out of things to write about Gnosticism. So that was, I felt like I kind of wrapped that up when I was leaving Dublin. So I had these various large-scale projects that I was working on, I'm still working on. And I'll try, maybe we can touch on those at the end. But because I was realizing that these were pretty open-ended research subjects, and that they were going to take quite a long time. And then I started working on yet another quite open-ended project about Welsh magic. And my aim was to collect historical Welsh magic. So basically the kind of spells and rituals that you can find in manuscripts throughout the ages, so everything from the very earliest textual piece of magic in Wales is probably actually written in Greek on a gold sheet that was found in Carnarvon. And then, there's a petition to the goddess Nemesis that's found in Caerleon which is also a Roman site. And then from there on through the ages, just basically everything I could find that was genuinely historical. And then I was realizing, okay, that's another huge project that I've real can of worms that I've opened up there. And then I found a 19th century book in Welsh that was a printed book, and I started translating that. Okay, so that was more of a finite project that I could get to grips to. And I actually I've sort of done a second draft of that book, but I'm something of a completist, and in the meantime, I'd become aware of a manuscript that's actually lost, that's known as Llyfr Cyfrin, a dyn hysbys, or Sir Denbighshire. So the secret book of the Cunning man of Denbighshire. And this was actually extracted in a book called Byd y Dyn Hysbys, which was published in the 1970s, which you know well. So one of your favourites, I know, Mhara. Yes, we have matching copies.
Yes, I didn't know that it came in hardback until I saw yours in Cardiff, because when we met in Cardiff, I had a bit of a fangirl moment because I saw that you were talking about Llyfr Cyfrin and the Dyn Hysbys and then the Tylwyth Teg, and I saw your copy on the table was in hardback, and I have two copies in paperback. One of them is battered to the extreme, the other one is in perfect condition. And then when I saw your copy was hardback, I had to go searching, and I found it in hardback, and I was like, I'm so glad that I saw yours, because I didn't know that it came in hardback at all. So I'm glad that you made me aware of that. Sorry to interrupt there.
Oh, that's interesting, because I didn't realize it had been published in paperback.
Yeah, the paperback one is very flimsy, so I kind of avoid that now, because if you kind of just pull it a bit too much, it just falls apart. But as old books want to do.
Yeah, and it's pretty rare as well. I mean, you can pay, unless you find it in some second-hand shop in Wales, you could pay 3 figures for it easily, I think. Yeah.
I've had so many people come to me going, how did you find it? Like, I just need a copy, and I wish that they would republish it, because so many people seem to have an interest. But yeah, it is quite a gem to come across, and I've been really fortunate because I live not too far from Llangollen, and Llangollen has like so many used bookshops that things just pop up. I found Byd y Dyn Hysbys, I found things like Coelion Cymru, and older books by people like Gwyn Thomas and things like that, and it's insane. So just, yes, if anybody's looking for books, go on a trip to Llangollen, you'll find them.
Byd y Dyn Hysbys is kind of a book about, it means the world of the Cunning man. And it's kind of, it was intended as a kind of general book about the cunning man in Wales. And so cunning men and women, or cunning folk, they were these magical practitioners who were very much embedded in their communities. They would perform practical magic for people. So they do a lot of divination. If you had a run of bad luck, they might do something about it. If your cattle were bewitched, they'd go and cure them. If you had something stolen, they'd try and find out who the thief was through magical means. So they were very much embedded in their communities. They were kind of more or less ordinary folk. They were literate. That was something that's interesting them. So they were, although they were the repository of traditional practices, they were also interested in all the new knowledge that was coming through, and also the kind of stuff that was starting to be reprinted at the beginning of the 19th century. The typical Dyn Hysbys would have a magical book with which he would impress his clientele. And some of these have survived. And so this one that we're talking about, the notebook from the Cunning man of Denbighshire, this is it's actually been lost now, but a lady, Kate Botter Griffiths, included extracts from it in this book, Byd y Dyn Hysbys. So I decided, as an appendix to this other book that I was writing, I would just include these fragments from this missing notebook, just to kind of add value to the book I was publishing. And then I thought, well, actually, I've made this project, what was meant to be a finite project, that much bigger. So, okay, I'm going to do a short book just on this lost manuscript itself. Surely that can't take too long. And now, over a year later, I still haven't quite finished it, but I have nearly finished it. What I did was I went and extracted all the little quotations that she had from the book, because her book isn't principally about this notebook. She's using the notebook as an example of the kind of stuff that Cunning folk did in Wales. And it's all kind of out of order. She has photos of about 8 pages of the book. And there's even some material in these photographs that isn't transcribed into the book itself. And so I did my best to put it all in order. And then I started looking at it. And I started thinking, okay, well, where does this stuff come from somewhere? Because we know that Cunning folk, they were, they were literate. They did a lot of research. They were kind of grabbing whatever they could get hold of to extend their repertoire and, learn more about magic. So I started digging into that, and I was able to find sources for almost everything in the book, and which actually meant that I was able to fill in some of the blanks. For example, Kate Bosser Griffiths mentions that several pages are denoted to geomancy, which is this system of divination where you can either just use a pen on paper or you can use a stick on earth. And depending on whether you leave an even or odd number of dots or dashes on the earth, whatever, you make a mark and you come up with these figures. And because it's a kind of binary system, there are a limited number of figures, and then you can start interpreting them, and it gets related to astrology. And this actually this was kind of always around, but it became quite popular again in the beginning of the 19th century. And it's apparently still very much a kind of thriving, living tradition in some Arab countries. So I managed to find really some of the exact sources of the geomancy that the author of the notebook was referring to, and I managed to fill in some other things. And there's a couple of little bits and pieces that I've found similar material, but I can't quite work out where it comes from. And one of the very most interesting bits of it is a journal entry in which the Cunning man describes meeting up with a farmer in Wrexham, and the farmer has actually been to another Dyn Hysbys called Sean of Rossa. So the notebook itself was quite short, and I could see the bits of it were taken from kind of popular publications of the time. But I started asking some other questions, like, could I work out who this guy Sean Rossas was? Okay, if it's from Denbighshire, what's the tradition of magic like in Denbighshire? And there's quite a strong tradition in surviving and stuff like court records and folklore and travellers' books about the kind of witches and wizards that existed in Denbighshire up to the 19th century. There's a focus on fairy magic in the excerpts in the notebook as well. So, okay, what connections are there between magicians and fairies in Wales? And I actually I've got kind of 2 whole chapters, basically just with almost kind of raw material, either from folk tales or from other sources, about how magicians related to fairies in Wales. And then even cattle bewitching. Okay, the author of the notebook doesn't tell us how he managed to unbewitch these cattle. But there are actually lots of examples in, folklore journals, the 19th century and that sort of thing, of accounts of people getting the Dyn Hysbys in and the kinds of things that they did. And there are actually surviving charms as well that have been found in barns. And I found 3 charms in the National Library of Wales bound into another manuscript. And I even contacted the guy whose grandfather had found a charm in his barn in Montgomeryshire, and that charm is still, it's a family heirloom, and it's a real part of their history. So I was able to. I was quite surprised just how much there was in those fragments that I was able to try and put into a context in Wales.
Oh, absolutely. I love the connection between, it's one of the things I talk about a lot on my kind of side of social media, especially over on TikTok, because I try and bridge the gap between modern witchcraft and these older folk practices and traditions and beliefs surrounding magic. And one thing that's kind of pivotal to a lot of modern witching traditions. I don't know if this interests you at all, but I know that some of the listeners might be intrigued by this, is that one of the main kind of core things within a lot of modern witchcraft is the way that modern practitioners keep a lot of their knowledge in books that they call, based on the works of Gerald Gardner and such, a book of shadows, or some people will use the term grimoire nowadays, which of course is what academics refer to books such as the Key of Solomon, which some of these cunning men would have been inspired by. But it's been reclaimed by a lot of modern magical practitioners because they want to try and move away from the Book of Shadows in Wicca. And because of that, I always offer, especially to Welsh practitioners, I always say, we have a term in Welsh and it's Llyfr Cyfrin. And it's a term that comes up in folklore. It's a term that comes up in books like the one by Kate Bosse-Griffiths. I love all the stories surrounding the cunning men and their magical books. One of my favorites being, it's a very well-known folk tale if anyone's into kind of magicians and folklore surrounding them, but it's the one where a cunning man sends a boy back because he's forgotten his magical book to get his book, and he says, "Don't open it though." And of course the boy does open it, and it unleashes a spirit out of the book which causes all sorts of chaos. But these books, they were quite an integral part of the, I suppose, culture surrounding these cunning men. And I also love the idea that they would have strapped them up in big kind of chains and such. It's something that Kate Bosse-Griffiths does talk about in one section of Byd yn Hysbys, where Dr. John Harries was said to have a book that it was said to be as large and as impressive as a Bible, but it was chained up and it was scary, and people knew that that was the book he used to conjure demons and play with all sorts of bad spirits and such. And there's one story in Byd yn Hysbys where Kate Bosse-Griffith says that there was a gentleman who went to John Harries' old house and asked for permission to look through his books. And he had his cousin with him for help and support to try and look through these books. And they came across, after looking through piles and piles of books on astrology and all sorts of kind of medical books and books on herbalism and such, they eventually come across this big book that looks like a Bible. And he says to his cousin, "This must be the Llyfr Cyfrin. This must be the big magical book where he keeps all his information on demons and such." And he turns around to look at his cousin to show him, and his cousin is crawling halfway out of the attic and trying to run away because he's terrified of this book. And then it turns out that book was nothing of much magic either in the end. But I do love it, and I think it's something that bridges the gap between modern practitioners and these more antiquated kind of forms of magic, is that we still do that to this day. As modern as it might be, we still keep books. I'm looking over to my shelf now where I keep all of my journals and notebooks, where I gather lots of different bits and pieces from everywhere. And it's nice to know that we're still somewhat following in that tradition. And perhaps in 500 years' time, people will be looking through our books and thinking, "Oh, what were the people in the 21st century getting up to magically?" in the same way we look at people from the 18th, 17th centuries nowadays. But I wanted to touch specifically upon that connection between fairies and magicians, because one of the more intriguing elements of Llyfr Cyfrin Sir Dinbych, this one that belonged to a cunning man from Denbighshire, is that it had portions of the notebook was written in Welsh, wasn't it? In particular, there was one bit which is referred to as Hyfforddiant i'r ysbrydion a elwir y Tylwyth Teg, which translates to a kind of a summoning or a calling to the spirits that we call the fairies. And I just wanted to pick your brains on, who are the Tylwyth Teg in this context? Because, of course, we have Tylwyth Teg in Welsh folklore, and they're quite liminal entities and spirits. But in this context, who are the Tylwyth Teg, and what role do they play in this cunning man's magic?
He includes a spell to summon the Seven Sisters. And in order to do that, actually, you have to call upon the king and queen Micob and Oberion before, and that's a very classic technique you get like in grimoires and in magic in general. You appeal to superiors to give you the kind of authority over spirits. So there's this list of 7 sisters that you call upon. There's a method, which is it's actually a very amicable, hospitable kind of Welsh kind of method, even though it doesn't actually originate in Wales. It has you basically set a feast for them. So you cook a roast chicken, and you have a jug of cream, maybe some beer, and in one version of it, even like sack sherry, like I don't know if you remember from Shakespeare, Falstaff was always drinking sack, a pint of sack. So you set a feast for them, and you appeal to their superiors, and then you invite the fairies to help you, and you can get them to do all sorts of things, particularly actually to look for a hidden treasure. That was part of the original purpose of this spell. And so this material is in Welsh, and it was evidently very popular in Wales in the early 19th century. So as well as the version in this notebook, Llyfr Cyfrin, there are actually 2 surviving versions at the National Library of Wales in manuscripts, one of which says it's already the copy of another manuscript. And then part of this spell was actually published in the very early 20th century in a newspaper, in Welsh language newspaper in London, and then it was collected into a book. And then it was even, republished in the 1970s in Beatty and Hespeth, the Kate Bosser Griffiths book. So it has this amazing continuity in Wales. And the spell itself has actually been translated from a spell that we find in English in the 17th century, in a manuscript known as Sloane MS 3824, that's actually been published by David Rankin in a book called The Book of Treasure Spirits. And this isn't just an English tradition, it was like a pan-European tradition with the 7 sisters. So these names are also found in continental sources, and there's this whole history that of 7 fever spirits that were known, and you can actually trace it back, arguably, somebody's been trying to trace it back all the way to Mesopotamia. So it's this incredibly ancient tradition that seemingly kind of went out of fashion in England in the 17th century. But because there's no trace of it apart from this manuscript that's that's in a library and got republished, I suppose about 15 years ago in English. But somehow that got translated into Welsh and then copied and copied again and copied again. And who knows, maybe there were other copies of it. And that's actually I found really interesting when I was researching links between magicians and fairies in Wales. We actually see Welsh magicians in London in the 17th century. There's a renowned English astrologer called William Lilly, whose writings are still kind of pretty influential in astrology. And he wrote this great little autobiography, quite a short book. And he's kind of, he was obviously a bit sort of self-obsessed, because he does describe how he goes to other magicians and astrologers and learns from them, but then he's always dissing them and putting them down. But he describes one Welsh guy called John Evans, who I think he's learned mainly astrology from him. But then John Evans's daughter, Ellen, was his scryer. So she was the one who would receive the visions, and he describes her using, appealing to Micob and Oberion, these same figures, back in the 17th century. So we have these Welsh magicians in London in the 17th century involved in this same kind of traditions, and then like in Denbighshire, we have this account of actually, unfortunately, these con men get coming up in the court records that they were promising people that they actually use the term the Tylwyth Teg, that if you gave them some money, they'd give the money to the Tylwyth Teg and they get good luck from it and that kind of stuff. And of course that's all you are going to find in the court records, is that you find the con men and the people who were disappointed and who got ripped off. You're not going to find the satisfied clientele and the reputable practitioners in court records, because that's not what it's about, So I was, I was actually leafing through the chapters that I really desperately need to go and revise and finish now, and there was stuff I'd forgotten that I'd discovered. For example, when we were talking about John Harris, there's only one bit of folklore that links him with fairies. But I was really thrilled to see that, I think it was last year, there was a kind of performance was put on near Bridgend in South Wales about John Harris and the fairies for children. And that's a side that we can kind of forget about easily, because the kind of interest in Welsh witchcraft and magic is quite international, through stuff like the Mabinogi and the way that Welsh traditions have been incorporated into modern paganism. But also this stuff does get recycled in Wales as well, and people get interested in it, and that there's a whole artistic side of Wales that's inspired by Welsh myth and folklore, in the present day.
Yeah, absolutely. I still get people reaching out to me lately since I've started kind of talking about this stuff online. It really surprises me how I get invited not just to events that are for pagans and witches and occultists, but I also get people who are conducting, research into certain areas of history for universities, and then people who are more on the artistic side, who are developing maybe festivals or days in celebration of Welsh culture, and they're like, and we want something witchy there. We want something that's very rooted in the magical culture of Wales. So can you come along and enchant us, maybe? And there's similar things going on all over Wales at the minute. I know that there's someone planning one in Denbighshire for later this year, and I'm hoping to go to it. But yeah, the Welsh seem to still be inspired by a lot of our old magical traditions and cultures, and I love that. I love that it's not only global, but also still developing here at home as well. I'm curious, because obviously we hear a lot about witches within I don't know if this is true for general culture worldwide, or if it's just our little niche subculture of witches and pagans. We talk a lot about things like the witch trials and people who were put on trial for being witches. I'm doing in air quotes right now. I have to make that clear because it's audio. The people who were put on trial for being witches. We hear a lot about their history and about who they were and what they were accused of. But when it comes to the magicians, we don't hear so much about them. So I'm just curious if there are any kind of tales or histories surrounding some of these magicians that really intrigues you and inspires you. And especially because of your line of work, I'm sure you know of a few magicians that were notable and worthy of a bit of mention.
Well, I've seen in Denbighshire, there were quite a few witches who were in the historical record. Because there were these, there was something of a fashion of travelling in Wales, of English travellers coming to Wales in the late 18th, early 19th century. And so they would meet these odd characters, and they would describe them. But there was, Mochyn Anant, he was actually the kind of victim of one of those accounts. Quite famous literary figure in 19th century, but he describes how he had a consultation with Mochyn Anant, who, if I remember, he was in Montgomeryshire, and he was basically kind of taking the piss out of him a bit, but and he can't even spell his name properly, which means it's sort of pig of the, what do you call it, dingle or whatever. Then there's we mentioned John Harris, Cwrdd Cadno. he was one of probably the very most famous of them. And there's lots of folklore surrounding him, all these great stories. And when you were talking about the his big book bound with chains and all that kind of thing, there was actually an account by somebody of trying to find his library, and about a couple of decades after he had died. But actually, this was another side project that I came up with. And you have to kind of. I've looked into so much stuff that I have to say my memory is failing me unless I sort of refresh myself just beforehand. But I was thinking of doing a book about again, a really kind of thorough one. Not with this sort of amazingly academic analysis or anything, or just including all the material I could find about the witches and wizards of Wales. And I probably have about 60 names so far. Every time I find something, I kind of create a little folder with the name of the person on it, and I just file this stuff away that people never heard of. I start doing the deep searches on the National Library of Wales site, because I don't know if you've looked at that. They've digitized all these journals and newspapers for the 19th century. And Wales had this amazing, thriving print culture in the 19th century. I mean, compared to the number of speakers of the language, and considering that we're next door to this major world language, of English, we still have a pretty good literary culture. And there's still, I don't know how many books published every year in Welsh, but in the 19th century, it was just crazy how much, and of course, a lot of it isn't interesting to us today because it was, like Methodist theology or really, really dull Eisteddfod poetry, like 200 lines on some subject that had been set for some obscure Eisteddfod. And, but there was a lot of it, and they had all these journals and periodicals. And I don't know, if your listeners are very familiar with the history of Wales, but we had these religious revivals with all these forms of Protestantism. So it was a genuinely grassroots phenomenon. There were all these tiny little chapels that were pretty independent of each other, and which, for the most part, was speaking Welsh, in the late 18th, early 19th century. And they were the conduit through which the language was preserved, and as a genuine living language, like in contrast to Ireland, for example, where because Ireland was so Catholic, worship wasn't done in the Irish language, and that contributed to the decline of Irish in comparison with Welsh. So these, the chapel culture helped to preserve the Welsh language, and it thrived, as well. On the other hand, it was very destructive to other aspects of Welsh culture. And for example, they didn't like dancing. People used to dance to the harp, and what more innocent activity can you think of than dancing to, harp tunes? But that the Methodists didn't like that, and they didn't like anything that smacked of folklore or paganism. What they supposed was paganism, much of which might have been early, even like folk religion about the saints, Welsh saints, and we've got loads and loads of saints who have kind of absorbed all these folk traditions into their own stories. So you get this really, really weird sort of otherworldly things happening, and these guys the stories of these guys who are ostensibly these hardline Christians in terms of the saints, around the sort of 5th, 6th centuries. So but the Methodists in the 19th century didn't, and not the Independents and the Baptists and the Presbyterians, all of them, they didn't like that stuff either. So along with the kind of the early influence of industrialism in Wales, that was pretty destructive to a lot of the folk traditions. But when you had this thriving print culture, and within a couple of decades, people were actually they were a little bit distanced from the folk traditions, but they were actually feeling quite fond of them because there's also this secularism at the influence of science and rationalism, so people could have feel okay, well, we don't do this anymore. But actually, when I was a child, we used to I actually remember going to the Dean Hospice, and we did such and such, and then they had all these traditions. So there were all these kind of antiquarian journals, or just ordinary newspapers might have a column, about, and with questions they have, does anybody remember, has anybody come across this toothache charm, and so there's loads and loads of material in the National Archives that's been digitized. And how I got onto this sort of side topic was I was saying that I was doing all these deep searches, and I just searched for keywords and all the various forms of them, and I was discovering all these people I'd never heard of. So and so had gone seeing this, basically a witch, and somebody else would respond in the next issue of this journal. Oh yes, I remember this tradition about her as well. And so there's just these masses of material, some of which some notable scholars have been digging up. There's one, Lisa Tallis, who's an academic and a librarian. She does really good stuff. And but there's just so much out there. I just want to kind of collect it and round it up and say, these are your traditions, oh Wales,
Absolutely. And I think that's definitely needed. I mean, that would definitely be something I'd be interested in. And I'm sure that most of the people listening would also say the same thing. So yeah, I'm just delighted that there are people like you out there who are now looking into these things and putting them on the map. As someone who is not an academic and I wouldn't say, I was going to be very self-deprecating to myself, but I'm not going to. Instead, I'll say, as someone who's not an academic and doesn't really understand fully how to navigate a lot of the academic world, a lot of this information is inaccessible in a way, because if you don't have a university membership, if you're not, part of a university or something, a lot of these journal articles and stuff, they're not really accessible to you unless you pay lots and lots of money to subscription services and such. So it's nice really that there's more people going out there and putting this stuff on the map, because it definitely deserves to be spoken about, especially at this time in the world where so many people are starting to find a lot of inspiration from folk traditions, folklore, folk magic, not just within a pagan context, but just within a historical context. I know recently I went to a conference that was held predominantly by archaeologists who study specifically charms of protection, apotropaic forms of magic that are hidden in buildings, so in churches, in houses, and such like this. And they were saying they're finding it very difficult to get the archaeological world to listen to them, I suppose, and say, it's actually quite important to note that while knocking down this 17th century cottage, that there was a dried cat in the chimney, or there was a shoe nailed to the wall behind the plaster wall that's been added much later, or there was a horse skull underneath the floor of this old church that is no longer in use. That these things are actually important to make note of, because they weren't just random, they were probably part of some kind of folk tradition that we don't want to forget. And like you were saying, there's a lot of houses now in Wales where people are starting to find these charms and these marks and such carved into the walls, and it's easy to miss, I suppose. It's easy to kind of tell yourself that if you find a bottle filled with a strange liquid in your attic, that it might just be someone decided that they couldn't hold it in long enough to go to the toilet, but in actuality could be a witch bottle. So yeah, it's nice that there's more of an interest coming, and I very much hope that you go on to do these projects, because they are very much needed, I think. So going off of that, you've written a book, or you're currently in the process of writing a book on specifically the connection between fairies and magicians. What can you tell us about it without without going into too much detail, because I can guarantee it now that I need it in my life, and I'm excited for when it comes out. So what can we expect from that book, I suppose?
Well, it's not quite it's about the notebook, you know. So, but I do have 2 or 3 chapters on the links with the magicians and fairies, and so what I did actually is I have one chapter which is about the historical people, historical magicians, and the links with fairies. So, for example, I mentioned John Evans and Ellen Evans in London, you know, it's Welsh people in London who William Lilly refers to, and some of the accounts of these unfortunate con men who which is still pretty interesting. You know, the kind of these guys are traveling around, and there must have been a lot more of them. And you do feel sorry for the people who were duped by them. But it does say a lot about the kind of beliefs that were around, and that there were these practitioners, everything. And then there are all sorts of accounts, like in the late 18th century, there was, I'm trying to remember the book, there was a book actually by a minister writing about the sort of superstitions as he saw them and the folk beliefs in a village in Monmouthshire. I don't know how they pronounce it locally, but I'd like at Aberystwyth. It, you know, is the way it's spelt. But because you never know in that part of the world, they might have some pronunciation that's really veered away from the Welsh. You know? But he describes there was a cunning man called Charles Hugh, who you know, he was drinking in a tavern with this guy, and the guy was going to go home, and he said, I wouldn't go home if I were you, because they're the Tylwyth Teg abroad, and but the guy ignores him, and he gets whisked away, and he finds himself in I think in Carmarthenshire, you know, 50 miles away from where from where he found some, and from where he was drinking in the tavern, you know, and then he makes his way back eventually, and Charles Hughes says to him, I did warn you, you should listen to him. And there are just, you know, quite a few of these things. Fairies are connected. Sometimes there's not an awful lot of detail. There's one instance in which fairies are connected with divination. I think that might have been Harris Cadno, actually, just this one little mention. But and then I have a whole separate chapter about kind of unnamed Dynion Hysbys, which are much more in the vein of folk tales that might be told for pleasure or as, you know, weird stories, that kind of thing. But they're a little bit different, because usually what happens, well, what we see in the more historical accounts is that magicians are trying to influence fairies, and, you know, like, so in the notebook of the Dean Hysbys of Denbighshire, he's going to summon fairies, and so they can do things for him. In the court records, the con men are offering to, okay, I'll get the fairies to give you good luck to, you know, to their clientele. So magicians kind of trying to influence, exercise control over the fairies. What you find in the folktales, actually, the typical form of them is that something goes wrong. An ordinary person has encountered the fairies, and, you know, they've completely disappeared. Somebody's brother, you know, like 2 brothers encounter fairies in a circle, and the one brother gets pulled into the circle and disappears. So the brother has to go to the Dean Hysbys and to find out what to do. But basically something goes wrong, and then you have to consult the Dean Hysbys or the Gwr Cyfarwydd. And there's one, my memory's failing me. This is quite a famous story set in South Wales. It's probably in the Welsh Fairy book, but it has real sort of grimoire style magic in it as well. You probably think of the name. It's the name of the village, and I think he has to get a cockerel and go to a crossroads, the Dean Hospice tells the sort of victim.
Is that the one with the changeling? Where
Yes, I think so. Llanfabon.
yes,
That's it. Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
the Llanfabon
Llanfabon. Yeah.
changeling, where she has to follow a very specific ritual in order to find out whether her child is a changeling or not.
Yeah, and the ritual really resembles classic kind of grimoire magic. So somebody's got that from somewhere, and uh, but they're really good stories. There's quite a few of them actually, more than I expected, because there was a recent dissertation on fairies in sort of Welsh literature, which was pretty interesting, and I found lots of things I didn't know in there, but it didn't include these folk tales and other accounts, so there's plenty to flesh out the tradition there, and it's a great story. So there's even this kind of there's this Somerset sort of storyteller in Somerset who was a friend of what's her name, Catherine. Who's the English? There's an English scholar.
Oh, is it Catherine Briggs or is it?
Yeah, Catherine Briggs. She was a friend of Catherine Briggs, and this lady, she had a story set on the borders, in the Welsh borders, but she doesn't. I'm a bit suspicious of it actually, because Catherine Briggs points out how it resembles this 17th century fairy spell that Catherine Briggs had actually published. And I think what had happened actually was this lady had gone and who was primarily a storyteller. She'd actually adapted this spell into a folktale set on the Welsh borders. She doesn't say where on the Welsh borders. It's a bit vague in the setting, but still, it's pretty interesting. So I include that and have a look at it, and that's an example of how stuff can make its way into, well, more or less folk tradition. Or the kind of thing that storytellers do. Storytellers aren't academics, and of course, if you're trying to be a careful scholar, you look at the stuff and you could be suspicious of it, but also it's an interesting, now that's part of fairy traditions about Wales, no matter what its source is. That's my kind, I can sort of grasp at a bit of postmodernism with these things. And that's part of my approach with Welsh stuff as well. I mean, the first time we had to go at recording this podcast until it was scuppered by the fairies, bendith Amamai, their mother's blessings. May they go in peace with there's that spell in it's kind of, what do you call it? An invocation to Gwyn ap Nudd in Latin.
Yes,
that survived, and it's the kind of thing that if that didn't exist, we'd be saying, oh, there's no sign that characters in the Mabinogi were ever appealed to as entities in the medieval period. But there's this spell that got preserved in this sort of Christian Latin text, and it's an example of somebody saying, this is what you shouldn't be doing. This is what these superstitious folk are doing. They're praying to Gwyn ap Nudd to, I think, to give them sort of safe passage through the woods. I think.
Yeah,
the thing.
That one is one that interests me because I'm currently, the way that my personal practice as a modern day kind of Welsh witch works is that I take inspiration and information from the past and I try and make it more modern. I suppose, as a lot of these cunning people were doing, they were taking the information that they had and making it as usable as possible. And I suppose that was their focus, was, does it work, as opposed to where it comes from. And I kind of do the same, except I do care where it comes from. I like to focus on Welsh things, or things that people within Wales would have at least incorporated. And the Gwyn ap Nudd one is an interesting little piece of kind of ritualized form of, I suppose, magic. We can call it folk magic, from is it 14th century, wasn't it? And it's interesting to me how different scholars have talked about it in different ways. So, as you were saying, that study that was done into the Tylwyth Teg as a literary motif by Angelica Rudiger, she very much talks about it as it's a way of ensuring that there's safety within the household from illness and such. But then you read the Oxford Guide to Medieval Folklore, and that one says, no, it's to protect people from the dangers of the forest. And I can kind of see that because the original Latin it's from describes having to hold a torch with fire and a piece of iron, both very much seen as a potchpake against fairies within various folk traditions from the British Isles. And it's interesting to me that like they called specifically to the King of Fairies to protect them from possibly fairies as well, and to help them from illness, which almost coincides with the idea of the Seven Sisters having these different abilities to protect people from illness as well through history. So it must have been a really big thing that people were worried about. And I probably will make a fool of myself now because I will probably mess it up. But I did memorize that Latin call to Gwynap
Oh,
Nydd,
really? Yeah.
and it goes, Gwynap Nydd, qui es ultra in silvis, pro amore concubine, tue permite venire domum, which translates to something along the lines of, Gwynap Nydd, ye who are yonder in the forest. Why do people medievalize it? Whenever you who are yonder in the forest, for the love of your lover or for the love of your concubine or mate, may you give us safe entry into this forest, or may you keep safe those within the domain. So it's kind of debated, I suppose, now because we have different translations of it. But I do love that one. It is a very interesting one, definitely.
And how I got started rambling off on that actually was because the word that's used, the Tylwyth Teg there, is the Eumenides, which is the Latin version of a Greek word, which means like it usually gets translated as the kindly ones. So it was a euphemism for the Furies. These absolutely horrific triple female divinities who were very old, who would pursue people who'd committed crimes, particularly in the Oresteia by Aeschylus, this Greek trilogy, tragedy. There's this whole sequence of crimes that have been committed through the family, of murders, and Orestes, the son who avenges his father, who's been murdered by his mother, he gets pursued by the Furies, and there's a whole section of the part of the trilogy which refers to this. And but you generally you don't refer to them as the Furies; you refer to them as the kindly ones. And this was how people were referring to the fairies. So that was why I wanted to bring that in because I don't know if people realise that the podcast. We had to go recording it before, and then your laptop completely and utterly failed.
Mm-hmm.
So I say, they're not they're benign beings. They're their mother's the mother's blessing. They're the kindly ones. We don't want to upset you.
We have to call them lovely things like Tylwyth Teg, which translates to the
Yeah.
fair family or the fair host, or Bendith Amamai, which is the blessings of the mother, so that we do not piss them off, I suppose, to put it in vulgar terms. But one thing I find really interesting, especially when we look at the work that you're doing, is the kind of discrepancy that there is between what a lot of modern day people who have an interest in folklore and folk magic and all of these streams of things, the perception that they have of fairies versus the older perception, it's getting better now. So like, I won't mention how some people obviously view fairies in a very juvenile manner nowadays due to the whole flower fairy Victorian aesthetic. But those who actually know folklore, they've kind of gone to the complete opposite, where fairies are now essentially demons in their eyes, and that they will cause all sorts of terror and strife in their lives, and that nobody should ever interact with them or kind of summon them in any capacity. And that extends nowadays even to those who have an interest in occulture and magic and witchcraft in general. So I remember recently it's not just modern day witches, but it's also occultists, because I was speaking to someone who identifies themselves as an occultist, and they were saying they won't touch anything to do with fairies because they're scared of them, essentially, but they'll summon demons, just not fairies. But it's interesting to me because from what you're saying, based on what's in these notebooks and such, it was more a case of that the common people who had no kind of background knowledge of magic were susceptible to the trickery of the fairies and such. But the magicians were who you'd go to if you were kind of taken on by them, I suppose. Am I right in saying that?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. In the Welsh folktales, the magicians always do the job.
They almost, there's, I think, is it Irish that they have the term the fairy doctors, is it, for magicians and cunning men? Like, they have this term fairy doctor because, for the same reason, that if the fairies did something, it was more likely you'd go to them to ask, like, help. How do I stop this? How do I get out of it? How do I deal with it? And it's interesting that that was one of the roles of these cunning men. It says a lot about what, even if it is just through folklore, it says a lot about the culture of fairies in Wales, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting in Ireland as well. Do you know the work of Eddie Lenihan? He's a storyteller.
Oh, I don't. Oh, wait. Yes, I do. I do know
Yeah,
the name.
he's in the west of Ireland, so kind of the real deal. And when he gets asked, "Have you ever seen the fairies?" he says, "No, and I hope I never do."
Yes. Oh my gosh. Something else I want to touch on as well is what you were mentioning about the Eumenides, because that's a really interesting piece of information there. But one thing I think a lot of people don't realize, or at least overlook, because it's not perhaps natively Welsh or considered natively Welsh, is that a lot of older sources were written in Latin. When we look at a lot of the kind of 14th, 13th, 15th century manuscripts that we have, a lot of them were written in Latin. And I think a lot of people struggle with that because they can't comprehend based on our modern day understanding. If you know a language nowadays, you speak and write in that language. Whereas at one point in history, you might speak Welsh fluently, but write in Latin instead. And I'm really intrigued by the way that a lot of kind of Welsh writers, or writers that were writing on Welsh history and such, use interesting terminology to describe fairies in Latin. So as you were saying, the Eumenides in this treatise where they're talking about Gwyn ap Nudd and such, but then also in Geraldus Cambrensis, the Gerald of Wales, in that one, when he's talking about Elidorus, who was a priest who was said to have spent some time in his childhood underground in the land of the fairies, in fairyland, the other world. He refers in the Latin as to the fairies, because it always gets translated into Welsh today as Tylwyth Teg, or the fairies in general. But in the original Latin, the word he uses is homunculi, which is another really interesting one, because it's, I think, probably more a reference to their stature, because in that story they are referred to as very short people who can ride upon the backs of greyhounds, which it's just another way that the fairies are contradictory within Welsh lore, because we have fairies who are said to be the same size as us, and then we have those who ride upon the backs of greyhounds and are very small. But it's interesting to me that they use the term homunculi, which of course is a term that comes up a lot in alchemy when talking about creating the homunculus, which is this tiny human entity that's kind of man-made. But within the kind of context of Welsh folklore, that story has been translated to be a story about the Tylwyth Teg, and it's likely one of the ones that influenced a lot of folklore surrounding the world of the fairies, because it's described as this underground abode where there's many riches and it's always a little dark and a little misty. And it's just intriguing to me that we have these discrepancies in what they're called, because of the multitude of languages that a lot of our literature was written in as well. So yeah, I think I don't know where I was going with that. I just thought I'd mention it because you mentioned the Eumenides.
Yeah, one interesting thing there is that the very first surviving occurrence of the term Tylwyth Teg in Welsh is in a poem which is part of the Dafydd ap Gwilym Apocrypha. So in other words, Dafydd ap Gwilym was he's still the most renowned poet in Wales, but definitely in medieval Wales, and he was like a kind of rascal who wrote this often love poetry in which, he's being lecherous and then all goes wrong. So often quite funny poems, and beautifully expressed using conjure, which this system of sound. It'll take me too long to explain conjure, but and anyway, so Dafydd ap Gwilym was in the 14th century, and then he had these imitators of him, and then so their work has been collected together called the Dafydd ap Gwilym Apocrypha. So these were things that seemed to be by Dafydd ap Gwilym, but they were actually by later poets. So I think it's from the 15th century. There's another poem, Anewl, the Mist, and it's just a comparison because these poems often had these sort of torrents of descriptions running through them, and it just compares the mist to it's like a magician fleeing the Tylwyth Teg. And that's the very first occurrence of Tylwyth Teg in Welsh, surviving occurrence, in literature. It connects it with a magician. It's quite interesting, I think.
So even from that early stage onwards, there were these correlations between magicians and fairies, and it's an interesting one too, because I'm not sure if well, you do run Welsh Myth and Legends on Twitter, and so I'm assuming this is within your purview, within your field of interest. But it's interesting to me because in the Mabinogi specifically, obviously the term Tylwyth Teg does not come up because it didn't exist yet by the time these stories were being collected, or at least not from what we know. Because, as you say, the first account of the term being used in written language was from the 15th century, so these manuscripts would have already existed by then. So what we have in the Mabinogi is, I would wager a bet that some of the characters are meant to be, or very clearly, otherworldly. Some of them very obviously so, such as Arawn and his kind of court from the first branch. They're obviously from Anovan, they're from the otherworld. But then you have characters that are more subtle, like Rhiannon, who, she's never referred to as a fairy. She's never referred to as being otherworldly, really, just through little motifs and such. And the motifs surrounding her are things such as riding on a white horse and being dressed in these gold brocaded silks that are the exact same material as the clothing worn by the denizens of the otherworld in the earlier story with Pwyll visiting the otherworld. So you have these kind of like little hints that these characters are otherworldly or different. And then you have specifically what I love about the Mabinogi specifically is you almost have two branches of magicians then, because in the third branch you have Llwyd ap Cilcoed, which a lot of the motifs surrounding him are very otherworldly, like the concept of mist being around him constantly, and he creates a castle that vanishes into thin air. He creates or conjures a white boar, which leads the heroes into this place, which kind of follows the same literary motif as the white dogs found in the first branch, that whole like little hint towards the otherworldly nature. But then you also have the magicians who are more earthly, who are not really otherworldly, like Math and Gwydion, and though they have otherworldly powers because they're magicians and wizards, they are also quite rooted in this world. They're not really otherworldly unless you really, really scrape hard to try and make it an argument. So it's interesting to me that even as far back as the Mabinogi, we have this kind of connection between the otherworld and otherworldly denizens, and then magicians and magical users. And yet we still have this, I suppose, core idea that there can be magicians from kind of both sides of the equation. There can be magicians from the otherworld. Whether we're looking at Arawn as a magician is up for debate, but he definitely can do things that are magical in nature, such as create a glamour over Pwyll to make him look like him. And then also we have the magicians like Math and Gwydion who conjure a woman out of flowers and such. So magicians have almost certainly been part of our culture for quite a while, haven't they?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think actually there's something else I wanted to say. Llay, I would give as an example, as somebody who starts out as somebody pretty much rooted in our world, except he has all these problems. He's been, about getting a name and a wife and bearing arms and everything. But then he gets killed, kind of, And then he's in the other world.
Mm-hmm.
And Gwydion has to go off and find him there. But I was saying when he was saying about the Latin texts as well, the Historia Britonum, I would argue that that's what gets referred to as Nennius. Although the monk Nennius was thought to be the author, but he's no longer thought to be the author, so they call it Pseudo-Nennius. But it's the history of Britain. And whoever compiled it said he just sort of piled up everything that he could find, and it has the oldest traditions that were written down, really, apart from some of the poetry, arguably, but that's also in Latin, and it has the story of Emrys or Ambrosius in it, which became incorporated into the story of Merlin or Merlin Emrys. And so he's basically like a kind of magician. And there's actually the word used for the wise men of Vortigern is Magi, but some people have argued that this is the sort of thing that scholars hate these days. But you could translate it druids, or you can translate it literally as magicians as well. He's trying to build a castle that kept falling down, but then they found this boy who didn't have a mother, and he was Emrys, and he told them how to do it, and that kind of thing. So that's, apart from some of the Christian stuff in the Historia Britonum, that's arguably the oldest surviving Welsh tale, I would say.
Absolutely. I think that will kind of take us now to a point where we can start wrapping up, because I've been taking your time now for almost an hour. So I just wanted to ask, before we kind of start wrapping up, where can we find you, and what can we expect from you? I know that you've got a book to plug, and I want you to plug it because I can't wait for it. But also, just where can we find you, and what else have you got going on at the minute? Anything you'd like to kind of promote?
Well, I do have websites that at the moment they have my other work on them. So I have, excuse me, andrewphillipsmith.com. That's all one word. There's 2 L's in Philip. Also bardicpress.com. And I'm my books on Gnosticism, they're being published by Watkins and Scarlet Paths and Quest. And I've also published under other books under my own imprint, Bardic Press. And I'll be doing this book under Bardic Press, and I still don't quite have the title. It might be something like Pages from a Welsh Cunning Man's Book. But then I keep thinking, I quite like that, but I think maybe that's more of a subtitle. So what do you think?
I quite like that.
And then because I went to the National Library of Wales and I consulted these other manuscripts which have the Seven Sisters spelled in. I was thinking of doing maybe another little offshoot, just a really short, quite technical book about the differences between these spells, how they compare to the 17th century one in English, and a little bit about the Seven Sisters tradition. Because I think somebody else is actually working on a book about the Seven Sisters, not from a Welsh perspective, but from this tradition, from the tradition spanning centuries and going off into Europe, or starting in Europe and everything. And then I should have the book about a Welsh book of knowledge, this printed book from the 19th century. That's got some really interesting stuff in it. A lot of folk astrology. There's stuff, it's quite amazing what was out there. Like the 4th book of Cornelius Agrippa got completely translated into Welsh in the 19th century. I'm not going to translate all that back, all the way back, but there's just, masses of material in this book. And then, like I said, I'm a completist, so I might get round to that book I was saying about Welsh witches and wizards, and then just every single historical Welsh spell that I can find. I'll put that into a book called something like Welsh Magic Through the Ages. And then I also have these other, it's ridiculous when I start listing these projects that I've been working on for about 5 years without actually getting anything finished. But I have a dictionary of Welsh myth and legend that I'm trying to make really thorough as well. And then a collection of source texts on Welsh myth and legend. So basically everything up to kind of the early modern period that isn't in the Mabinogi. So, for example, I would include the those tales from the Historia Brittonum, but all the bits in the triads, saying there are all these tiny little fragments often of tales that are sort of hidden away in the appendices of other books. So some of them have only been published in Welsh academic journals, and there are even little bits and pieces that got published in the 19th century journals. So I've been trying to collect as much of this as I can and just sort it all out, organize it according to maybe the sort of the theme or the cycle, the stuff about Merddin or whatever, and just put it all together and bang it out then. And so, because there was something that got to me, I think I was saying the first time we recorded this, I'm in my late 50s, and when I was growing up in sort of anglicised South Wales, I actually got the Mabinogion and the Welsh myths and legends via these fantasy books written by English and American authors. So I loved hearing them. My mother would read them at bedtime for me. Stuff like the Chronicles of Prydain, the Book of Three and all those by Lloyd Alexander, who was American. The Dark is Rising sequence by Susan Cooper, and The Owl Service by Alan Garner. And I love his stuff. He's a terrific author, Alan Garner. He's a pretty old guy now. But the Owl Service is set in Wales. And to be fair, Alan Garner actually, who's from sort of Cheshire, he actually learnt some Welsh, and he spent some time in Wales researching this. And it's based on the fourth branch and the story of Blodeuwedd. And there are these sort of young teenagers who get caught up in the roles of the characters in the fourth branch. And there's the service, it's like a dinner service with these patterns on it that could be either flowers or owls, and gets linked in the whole story. So it's a great book. But at one point, I can't think of the name of one of the characters, but he's the local Welsh boy in it, and they're referring to the Mabinogion, and he said, this mouldy collection of old tales, it's not much, but it's all we got, and that really got my goat, because apart from it, it's not true. There's much more to Welsh culture than that. There's much more that isn't in the Mabinogion, and of course, because it's never been collected in one place, we get it in dribs and drabs, or we get it through retellings. And so I just wanted to put all that together, and then people do what they want with it. If you're interested in Welsh culture from a more pagan perspective, probably find stuff that you can use. Or, we were saying that, there's a lot of literary stuff and art is based on themes from the Mabinogion still in Wales, and to some extent, stories from the Welsh saints have filtered through a bit. For example, I live in Cadoxton, which is named after Cadoc, the one of the saints, and in the local church, which is pretty old medieval church, in which this wizard William Jenkins and his family are buried there. Actually, there was a play about Cadoc and performed in the church, and they actually went round doing it in all the churches dedicated to Saint Cadoc, and this was about sort of these young people researching the stories of Cadoc and being somewhat sort of possessed by him. But anyway, so some of this stuff does make its way into Welsh culture, but there's so much more. And I just, I'd love to see people rediscovering that material through my book and having a bit of a renaissance, really. That sounds pretty ambitious, doesn't it? But I'd like, as far as I'm concerned, I just collect it and put it out there, and then hopefully people will, take the ball and run with it.
Well, I think all those ideas sound absolutely excellent, and I'm very much looking forward to it. Well, thank you so much, Andrew, for coming and chatting to me today about all things magical and wonderful within a Welsh context. I'll make sure to put all the links to your pages and such in the show notes below. But yes, I just wanted to say thank you so much again for agreeing to come talk to me, and I'm so glad. I'm crossing my fingers that this processes properly, because the last time we tried to record, they did not want it at all. So hopefully we've done well within their eyes this time. So thank you so much again. Diolch am dod ar. Thank you for coming on.
Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you once again to Andrew for joining me on the Welsh Witch podcast. And if you're interested in purchasing Andrew's book, Pages from a Welsh Cunning Man's Book, Magic and Fairies in 19th-Century Wales, published by, of course, his own imprint, Bardic Press, then it's available now. You can purchase it via the Bardic Press website and also on Amazon. Links to Andrew's social media as well as to the book will be found in the description of this podcast episode. If you're listening on YouTube, it'll be in the description below. Diolch o galon. Thank you from the heart for listening to this episode. The only thing that keeps these podcast episodes going is my Patreon. So if you're interested in supporting me as I share the magic and lore of Wales and receiving some benefits as a little reward and thanks for your support, then why not come and join me over on my Patreon? My patrons listened to this episode months in advance to everyone else, and they get access to all of my content early, as well as exclusive, unseen content that doesn't get uploaded anywhere else on the internet. As a Patreon, depending on the tier that you choose to follow me on, you might also get access to exclusive courses, videos, and all sorts of other content that I put out there. So if you're interested in exploring the magic and lore of Wales, then come follow and support me over on Patreon for as little as £1 a month. Links to join will be in the description below. Or simply type in patreon.com/Mhara Starling, MHARA STARLING. Thank you for listening. I hope you tune into the next episode, and we will see you soon. Goodbye.